Hey everyone, so time to talk about point of view. So I wanted to start off with this meme because I feel like, like we talked about earlier in the term, it's week 1.5. So, like we talked about, sometimes memes show us stuff about our society, right? So let's look at this one. A baby holding a cell phone. Today at church, a guy in a suit tried to drown me, and I kid you not, my family just stood there taking pictures. Now, most of you could probably gather that this was a baptism, but think about it from the baby's perspective. What is the baby thinking, right? Everything is about perspective. Who's seeing it? How they understand what's happening? How things are interacting with them? Is it new? Is this something that's happened before? Is this something that happens routinely, right? And think about how that makes an impact on how the story is being told. Okay, so I want to take this idea of perspective and I want to put it into more specific terms. Okay, so we have different types of point of view. We have first person point of view, second person point of view, third person limited, and third person omniscient. Each of these are different perspectives. Okay, and I want you to think of it as perspective. So with first person perspective, someone is telling the story. Okay, it can be a main character, it can be a lesser character, but they are telling the story from their particular involvement in the story. Okay, they are directly involved in the narrative and they tell you about it. That's first person. Okay, this is using I, we, our, that sort of language. Okay, and that's a good signal that this is a first person account. Okay, so that's nice and easy, right, to get that definition down. But there are some things you need to ask yourself. Okay, again, this meme shows up because you need to ask yourself, well, is this perspective reliable? Are they? People, representations, which characters represent, right? People, are they reliable? People lie. People tell stories that are biased without even realizing. A lot of times people will, be telling a story and they'll slant it so that it makes them look better or so that it doesn't make them look quite as negative, right? So you need to consider reliability. Also, you want to think about what they gain by telling you the story. Why are they there? What is their purpose? Why are they telling you this? Why are they taking that time? Ask yourself, what's their relationship to the story? Okay, how are they connected? What could they lose by potentially being truthful or, conversely, untruthful? And how is their perspective limited by events? Okay, if they're telling a story and someone that they're talking about comes back in from another room, for example, and they're speculating about what that person was doing in the other room, then you kind of want to think, okay, well, do they actually know this? How do they know? Right? Those are questions that you want to ask yourself about first person. Let's move on to second person. Okay? Second person is when the writer directly addresses the reader. This is the least common point of view. I think it's a little weird, personally. I never liked those choose your own adventure books, that sort of thing. You're walking down the street and do you turn left or right? I don't care. Tell me the story, right? But a lot of people like that interaction. And there's a popular example that happened recently. Black Mirror came out with Bandersnatch, right? And that was a second person perspective. One of the Final Destination movies also did that, where you get to choose kind of what happens to the people, in the story, which is interesting. But that level of interaction, does it work? Doesn't it work? It's kind of up to you to decide. Okay, but that's when the writer directly addresses the reader. Like I said, it doesn't happen super, super often. So an example of this is you're running through the forest and you see that a large tree has fallen in front of you. Fleetingly, you consider your options. You could either run around the tree to the swamp on your left, the swamp with the alligator eyes darting after you as you run down the trail, or you could take the time to climb over the tree. You hold your breath for a moment, listening for the man sprinting closer behind you. You know he's there, waiting for the moment that you slow down. You turn to the left and plunge into the swamp, right? It's this idea of you as a person, as a reader, are a character in the story. You're directly involved. Okay, so you want to think about that. Okay, so what does that mean? Does this mean that you personally, as a reader, bring your own particular perspective into the story? Does it mean that you listen to the perspective that's being fed to you and you sort of put yourself in that role? These are questions that you need to ask about that. And like I said before, this isn't a very common perspective for writers to take. So you don't necessarily, we're not going to bump into it in our class. But if you're reading anything, you want to make sure that you're considering this sort of perspective and these sort of questions. Ask yourself why. Why is it that me, as a reader, why am I doing this? Why did I decide to go get eaten by an alligator rather than, like, hang out and take my chances with the guy that's following me, right? Why? Why? That's the big question. Why? Okay, and then let's move on to third-person perspective. Okay, there are two types of third-person perspectives that we talked about earlier, right? One is third-person limited, and one is third-person omniscient. So you can tell when a story uses a third-person perspective because they use he, she, it, them, a character's name, rather than I, we, us, our, you, etc. Okay, you can kind of think of it as, someone outside the story is telling the story. So let's think about third-person limited. So this third-person limited perspective, the narrator can then see information about characters that surround a particular person. Usually there is like one person that's a main character that the perspective follows, and then other people kind of around them get involved in it as well, but once they leave, it doesn't really typically happen. Okay, so you could think like Harry Potter, right? You don't often see characters away from Harry Potter having situations, but you could, right? Because that does happen. But for the most part, even though you get an idea of, Harry Potter and kind of who he is and that sort of thing, we don't necessarily get to see his thoughts too much, right? So, the Harry Potter books kind of bounce back and forth just a little bit between this limited perspective and the omniscient perspective that we're going to talk about in just a second. Okay, you can also think of it as, so you're sitting in a classroom, your teacher's up at the front, whatever, and there's a person that's looking in through the door, right, that's viewing the classroom, but they don't get to see the inner workings, right? They just get to see what's happening on the surface. That's third-person limited perspective. Okay, so let's move to third-person omniscient perspective. This is someone from outside the story is telling the story. Okay, the narrator can convey the information about all of the characters. They understand things about any of them. They can read their thoughts. They can understand their motivations. Right? This is omniscient. They don't necessarily have to disclose these ideas, right? But they do share the information. Okay, you can think Tolkien's Lord of the Rings trilogy. If you want to think back to, gosh, it must be almost 20 years ago now, Lost, when it was on TV, right? We got to see elements of all of these different characters and kind of see what their thoughts are and what's happening around them. Okay, so that's third-person omniscience. So back to our example of a person peeking into a classroom and watching, right? So they peek in, they can hear what the people are saying, they can hear what the students are thinking. If the teacher's doing something stupid and one of the students thinks it's funny, and they're kind of thinking about why it's funny, that person looking through the door would be privy to that. Okay. If the teacher's sitting up at the front of the classroom doing something stupid and they're thinking, oh goodness, this is going to end up on YouTube, right? The third person omniscient perspective would know that, right? So you want to make sure that you know the perspective that is being conveyed by the story, and that you roll with that and you ask questions. It's the asking questions that makes literary analysis so important. And honestly, what makes any type of analysis so important? You need to ask questions. If you can make a statement, that's great, but then ask yourself why you made that statement. Why is it that someone from outside the story can come in and be unbiased? Can they be? Is that possible? Is it ever possible to be unbiased? Is there a reason that they're telling you this information? Right? You want to think deeper than just the surface level. You want to dig in and really understand what they're trying to say, what the author is trying to say to you. The author's trying to make you ask questions. So just roll with it. Ask the questions. Keep asking why until you come to a point where there's no more whys to ask. And then ask someone else, and then they'll help you figure out more whys. Because there's always something to find. You can read the same book 50 times and find something different every time. okay? And a huge part of that comes from perspective. And then also the other ones that we talked about, the other videos that I've posted this morning, comes from setting, comes from character development, right? Each of these things. So you really want to think, why? That is the big, big thing. Okay? Why?